Let's now be joined by the Heritage Foundation's Niall Gardner, who has walked us through something similar just in the past few months, that of Boris Johnson, now Liz Truss. Niall, thanks so much for being with us. I want you to explain to people here stateside who might not have a good grasp of parliamentary politics, the mechanisms of that, how Liz Truss was just in this 6 weeks ago, how someone who could be in this position for so short of time could now be out. Explain that.
Well, Andrew, thanks very much for having me on the show today. And what an extraordinary time it is in British politics. You have a Prime Minister who's been in power for only 44 days, the shortest serving Prime Minister in British history. She's going to be departing from Downing Street at the end of this month. The new Prime Minister will come in by October 31st. A new leader will be selected, in fact, by next Friday, next week. So just astonishing, the speed of developments. And so basically what has happened is that Liz Truss lost, I think, the confidence of her own Conservative Party. And prime ministers really serve at the pleasure of their own political parties. So that British people vote, of course, for political parties. So it's different from a presidential system where voters directly vote for a president. In the United Kingdom, they vote for political parties and each party has a leader. And so Liz Truss came in as Conservative Party leader after winning a leadership contest among Conservative Party members following the departure of Boris Johnson just a few months ago. And so the fact that she's going after 44 days is just absolutely stunning. And it's the result of a rebellion inside the ruling Conservative Party. A large number of Conservative MPs, mainly on the left of the party, I have to say, basically withdrew their support from the Prime Minister. She came under a very sustained attack, actually, also from the IMF, from the Biden administration, from international institutions over her recent mini budget, which advocated a series of, in my view, perfectly sensible tax cuts. But this prompted a reversal by the Prime Minister, whereby she sacked the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, replacing with Jeremy Hunt, who is a Tory wet or on the Liberal side of the Conservative Party. And so she lost increasing support from both the left and the right of the Conservative Party, and the position became untenable yesterday when Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, resigned. And that was the final, I think, blow, I think, for the Liz Truss premiership, and it was game over.
Yeah. Now, you on Twitter described this as a Shakespearean tragedy. I want to know why you characterized it in those terms. And, you know, what does this say? Many people are likening what's happening in the UK to what's happening in Israel, to what's happening in Italy, where the dysfunction is really set in here. Yeah.
I mean, the UK really has a long tradition of political stability. So what we're seeing now is very, very unusual. In fact, I would describe it as unprecedented in British history. The scale of changeovers that we've seen, the departure of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister, and next, you know, by the end of next week, we'll have a new Prime Minister chosen by the Conservative Party. So I've never seen this pace of change before in the United Kingdom. I don't think that previous generations have either. And I do think there are unfavorable comparisons now coming in with places like Italy, for example. But, you know, the reality is, however, that the British political system remains overall very stable despite the changeover of prime ministers. The government's still in place. When a new prime minister comes in, you'll have a new cabinet. But you know, this is not a situation whereby, you know, you are seeing, you know, the complete collapse of the British government. You're seeing the prime minister being replaced. You're not seeing a general election, I think, for probably another couple of years, because the Conservative Party doesn't have to hold one, or the Conservative government doesn't have to hold an election until the end of 2024. And the Labour Party is a big lead in the polls, around 20 to 30 points. So the Conservatives are in no mood to hold an early general election. And I think whoever becomes the Prime Minister at the end of next week will lead the British government for probably at least 2 years.
Yeah, Niall, I want to put up this tweet, something that you were alluding to, the rapid pace of history unfolding. This from Alan McGuinness. I think he's with Sky News. He said, "My son has lived through 4 chancellors, 3 home secretaries, 2 prime ministers, and 2 monarchs. He's 4 months old. Really, we've seen a decade's worth of history, really in a month's time there in the UK. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, we have actually, and that's a very cleverly written tweet there, and it does reflect the astonishing pace of change that we have seen, in fact, over the last few months or so, and also, as that tweet points out, of course. We have a new King, King Charles III, who is going to welcome a new Prime Minister at the beginning of November or the end of October. So these are extraordinary times. But at the same time, I do think that the United Kingdom is going to do just fine. The UK is facing a lot of economic challenges. They're not greater than the challenges that the United States faces, for example. In fact, if you look at the Biden presidency and its response to the economic crisis here, it's been an absolute disaster. The level of inflation in the United Kingdom is similar to what it is in the United States, is slightly higher. It's much lower than much of Europe. In some countries, the inflation rate is double what it is in the United Kingdom. The UK is facing soaring energy prices, which have been capped by the Liz Truss government. But the reality is that Europe faces a far greater challenge because of their dependency upon Russian energy. And Germany may face a series of blackouts this winter as a result of their dependence on Russian energy supplies. The UK isn't dependent on Russian energy. And so while you're seeing some political turmoil here, it doesn't compare, frankly, to the massive problems that you're facing in much of the European Union, especially the big powers, France, Germany. In France, you've had a series of strikes there, which have made it very difficult to buy gas at gas stations, for example. Huge queues forming. A third of the country's been without gas now for some time. Absolute turmoil in France, actually. So, what's happening in the UK? Yes, a very British coup has taken place, but the government's in place, a new prime minister will be in place. I think it'll be business as usual quite soon.
Niall, let's just talk about the economic policies that really was, quite ruinous for at least the decisions to put them in place and then reverse them. Quite ruinous for her political fortunes. These economic proposals were reversed in due course because really the market was responding so unfavorably to them. The Bank of England had to intervene several times, and then Jeremy Hunt stepped into the role as Chancellor of the Exchequer and really just reverse everything Liz Truss wanted to do. Many have said that her, nostalgia for some of these Thatcherite policies when it comes to the economy back in the 80s was also really part of her ruin as well. What do you make of some of those assessments?
Yeah, so the mini budget that the Prime Minister put forward about a month ago or so, it actually had very sensible tax cutting proposals, lowering the top rate of tax to 40 pence in the pound. That's still actually higher than the top rate in the US, which is 37 cents in the dollar. The UK wanted to cut corporate tax rates, wanted to reduce overall income tax rates. These were all sensible ideas. Now, the markets responded, yes, negatively, not least because the IMF intervened and condemned the tax cuts, actually. And the IMF intervention was absolutely catastrophically bad for the British markets. And that put the pressure on the Prime Minister. The Biden administration also, alongside the IMF, attacked the tax cuts in the UK. That didn't help, and Biden launched a direct attack on the Prime Minister over the weekend. And so a lot of unhelpful outside intervention. But also, I think at the same time, the Conservative government didn't really explain where the money was going to come from the tax cuts. So that was a failure. And, Margaret Thatcher, of course, always explained where tax cuts were coming from, how they would be funded. And at the end of the day, you've got to reduce government spending to fund tax cuts. Liz Truss didn't make that clear. In fact, government spending is going up. And you can't fund tax cuts by increasing government spending. And so that spooked the markets in terms of, creating some early Halloween-style fear.
Yeah.
But I think it's striking, though, that, if you look at the policies of the Biden administration, they're absolutely disastrous on the economic front. Soaring inflation, the worst inflation in 40 years. Massive levels of government spending, trillions of dollars being spent by this administration. But the IMF hasn't said a word about that. And the reason is because the IMF coordinates very closely with the White House. And so they attacked the British government, no doubt at the, with the support of the White House. But the IMF will never condemn Joe Biden for his absolutely ruinous policies that are creating immense hardships for many Americans in the United States.
Yeah. No, I was just struck by the fact that essentially, your equivalent to a Treasury Secretary really essentially overruled some of these policies by the Prime Minister there in order to calm and settle some of the markets. Okay, so is it inevitable? Does a Labour government eventually come in here? Are there just not enough seats and not enough support on the Conservative side? They've been in power for some time. Are we going to see Labour in power now?
No, I don't think that it's inevitable you're going to have a Labour government. And, as I mentioned earlier, there's no need for the Conservative government to hold a general election for at least 2 years. 2 years is a very long time in politics. And the last I checked, the Socialist Labour Party didn't even have any real economic policies at all. In fact, they haven't declared exactly what the policies are going to be, what their tax rates are going to be, etc. This is a party that's completely clueless and with good reasons been out of power for the last 12 years or so. And so the Socialists have only ever brought economic ruin to the United Kingdom. And so I suspect that most voters are going to be very wary of putting the Socialists back in power, although they're in the lead at the moment with, 20 to 30 point lead in the opinion polls. But that doesn't mean anything. 2 years from now, it could be completely different. Yeah. If the Conservatives turn around the economy, do a good job, demonstrate real competence and efficiency, I think it could be a very, very tight contest for the 2024 general election. And so it's not a foregone conclusion the Socialists are going to be returning to power at any time soon.
Okay, just lastly, Niall, what about Boris? Where does he factor into this? Many are kind of throwing his name out there. Could he see some type of political renaissance?
In fact, I was just looking at the latest figures for Boris Johnson among Conservative MPs. And so the latest polling among MPs shows that Boris has around 50 members of parliament already supporting him just in the space of about 9 or 10 hours. He needs 100 to be on the ballot on Monday for the leadership contest. He'll easily exceed that figure probably by Saturday. If Boris Johnson makes it to the final round of voting, which takes place among Conservative Party members from Tuesday to Friday next week, I think he's home and dry. He's going to win big.
Wow.
Because Boris is very popular among Conservative Party members. The grassroots are on the right of the party. Boris Johnson is hugely popular with the Brexiteers. Most party members opposed his removal several months ago, actually. And so if Boris makes it to the final round and it looks as though he's definitely going to make it, he wins. I would say that Boris Johnson is likely to be the next Prime Minister again.
Wow. All right, Niall Gardner with a pretty awesome, stunning prediction there. We'll see if it rings true. Always a pleasure, Niall. Thank you so much for offering your insight.
My pleasure. Great to see you, Andrew. Thanks very much.
Yes, of course. We'll see you again. Okay, right now we do want to stay with this topic, of course. Take a look at this tweet because you can see here, this was kind of a running joke in the UK as whether or not a lot of political watchers thought that Liz Truss was going to survive longer than this head of lettuce here. The expiration date of a head of lettuce, apparently 7 days. Liz Truss did not survive it, so the lettuce won. You can see now they put a wig on that head of lettuce with the Union Jack there. So that was kind of a running joke here and across the pond. So many kind of got a kick out of that. Okay, so we have broken this down. This is quite interesting. Okay, UK prime ministers with the shortest tenures. Okay, Liz Truss, 45 days. George Canning, 121 days. Frederick John Robinson, the Viscount Goderich, 144 days. Bonar Law, 210 days. William Cavendish, 236 days. And William Petty, 267 days. So Liz Truss, the shortest lived prime minister in modern history.